Hello and welcome to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and I'm joined today by John Clark and Father Michael Duesterhaus. Welcome to the studio.
Thanks for having us.
Good morning.
And today we're going to be talking about annulments because we've had both of you on as guests already to discuss two different aspects of the annulment process and why annulment rates are going up and the fact that they're going up in today's world. So now we're going to have another discussion all together on this topic. And I think some of the key points from our previous episodes were that the annulment rate has significantly increased over the past 60 or so years. And then we discussed whether or not these potential issues are problems within the annulment process or problems in society at large. And while annulment numbers were rising, the marriage rates dropped. So obviously the church needs to promote and defend the sacrament of marriage. So I guess we'll just start by discussing what are some reasons that the annulment numbers skyrocketed. And maybe, John, you should start by answering this since your book was on that.
Why they skyrocketed? Okay, actually, Colleen, if it's okay with you and Father, could you lead us in a prayer just
Sure.
before we begin?
Father, Son, Holy Spirit, amen. Eternal Father, assist us as we continue to go forward in faith, hope, and love. May we set good examples of our lives. May you assist people who are wounded in their marriages. May we find always knowledge in thy gift of the Gospels. We make this through your Son, Jesus Christ. Lives, reigns you in the union of the Holy Spirit, God forever and ever. Amen.
Amen. Okay. Just so your readers know, I'm not making, your viewers know, I'm not making the sign of the cross backwards. I'm actually Eastern Catholic. So just to clarify that.
Then that's no longer a sin.
Okay, good. So, all right, Colleen, so back to your question, why the annulment numbers went up. Well, it's a pretty long question. I'll try to give some highlights, or I guess sort of lowlights. I suppose that it started back in the 1930s and 40s with the sort of the advent of personalism, where the idea that the primary purpose of marriage was no longer the procreation and education of children, but that would have been an end alongside several others. Personalism was a bit of was the problem, I think, that sort of started the problem. And so what began happening is that people would begin to define marriage as good marriage, or let's say, like I've mentioned on several interviews for my book, that I've had a crush on my wife Lisa since Ronald Reagan was in office. It's true. And so I believe I have, and I think Elisa would confirm this, that I have a storybook marriage. But the thing about validity, you don't have to have a storybook marriage to have validity. But what happened with some of the personalists was that was sort of their argument. It was sort of at that point at its embryonic stage, but that was essentially much of the argument. When the Canon Law Society of America became, in effect, what I call in the book a monopoly, the argument basically took a lot stronger form, and the primary end was not extinguished, but it was relegated to at least not primary. And so, what happened there is that that was the philosophical idea behind what happened. Philosophically, that was much of the issue. And so then you have then we can fast forward a little bit to the adoption of the American procedural norms, where things changed significantly. I don't want to bore I keep saying your readers, bore your listeners with that, but I break that down in the book and explain how we went from 338 annulments in 1 year to a generation later to over 70,000. And if you read the Canon Law Society of America's sort of big tome on canon law explained, the examples they use in there are pretty bad, but it does show you sort of how we got from point A to point B. So that's maybe the start of the answer to your question, and maybe Father can
and I think
take it from there, because I think we agree.
Well, I appreciate what he started with. People start looking at the 70s and the data, but you have to go back decades to see the roots of it all. There's a couple other things, because I'll go back to my formation. I had a very good seminary formation. Instead of talking about primary, we talked about the three goods of marriage. The good, of children, and the bond and permanence. So the language changed, and there also was, and this is a big discussion about some of the documents of Vatican II were written. How much did the church shift its mentality of, the church's role as the, inheritor from Christ the King of the truth to being a voice amongst many? So I think there's those kind of things going on. Remember also, Catholics kept to themselves in the United States as immigrants, 30s, 40s, 50s. Mm-hmm. When you start having a growth in the intermarriage rates, you look at the influence of, no-fault divorce by 1972. That was huge. Mm-hmm. And because once that happened, the 1970s did not have women's lib, had men's lib. Men were liberated from everything. First, they got no-fault divorce so they could walk out anytime they want. Then they got abortion. So if you got pregnant, it's on you. Then by 73, 74, every state said any woman can have the pill. So it's on you if you get pregnant. And then there's other legal things that pretty much let men father children outside of marriage and have any legal or even financial obligation. So you just have this kind of spilling out. Toss on top of that, the church is not in a good shape in the 70s and 80s. And then I think the procedural norms, and I'm not going into a lot of detail there, but as I mentioned when we were first time talking, Americans are great at paperwork. We invented the ditto machine. We brought you the Xerox. Right now, and just in the last 2.5 weeks, I have met with 9 different couples related doing cases for annulments. Wow. Because that's my responsibility. And while I'll talk to them, all our forms, you can go to our diocesan website. They're PDFs. You can download them, fill them out, and in a certain sense, turn the handle crank, and it can become truly a paper chase. And also, as I mentioned, we met our first time. I truly do believe in certain priests' mind, certain clerics' minds, and certain tribunals, there is a divorce mentality. Mm-hmm. There is no pushback. There is no notion of, hey, have you worked on reconciling? What's going on? And then I want to come back later to the issue because of these 9 couples I met with. Only 2 were Catholic marriages. Okay. The other 7 are outside the church.
Did that change? Because I was reading one article and it sounded like in the new canon law from I think it was 1983. 83 code. They allowed non-Catholics to be able to ask for annulments. Was that something that was beforehand?
No, that's always been there. It's just we didn't have that much intermarriage rate. Okay. And that also a positive thing, as I mentioned again when we met last time, you made a clip of it. If you actually ran a really good RCA program and had 40 people show up, you're going to have 12 to 15 people with baggage. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because I know that's a very common thing is people that are coming into the faith need to have their marriages annulled before they can come in. So I wasn't sure if that had changed with the Code of Canon Law or like you were saying, which it sounds like the answer is that you had more intermarriages. So
Could I ask a question as a follow-up to what Father just said?
Yeah.
Okay. So Father, you said that you're interviewing 9 couples. You said 2 of them were Catholic marriages. And the 7 were, how would you designate the other 7?
Individuals who want to marry a Catholic. At least 4 of them are not even baptized. 2, it's doubtful if they ever were. And it's just every stray cat and dog. One of the cases is, I have never presented a case in 35 years I did not believe had merit. Mm-hmm. I do not go on fishing expeditions. I am particularly perturbed when they keep pushing the same grounds of lack of due discretion as the first thing out of the gate. It can be a ground. It shouldn't be the only thing. But I spent an hour and a half talking to a young man, baptized Christian, who got married to a Christian in a Protestant church. And without going into personal details, after an hour and a half, I could not think of any reason why his first marriage, because he also married again, Now he wants to marry a third time to a Catholic. But any reason why that marriage was null is he just walked away. Well, that's very sad, but there was no force or fear. There was no lack of knowledge or information. There was long dating and courtship. And, I'm drilling down trying to see if there was anything. And the reason he was talking to me is because he's, I have this really bizarre homily I give once a year. If you're single, please don't date married people. And if you're married, please don't date anyone but your spouse. And if people did that, my life would be so much easier. All right. My problem is, and I hate to point fingers, it's predominantly a female problem. Catholic women keep dating married men. Find a single guy. If a guy's been already married before, probably after the second date, you need to back off. Just my 2 bits. So,
yeah. I was just the reason that prompted my question, Father, was that obviously that if you have 2 baptized persons, I mean, you can have sacramental marriages that weren't done in a Catholic church,
right?
In effect. So yeah. So I just want to make sure that viewers understood that, because that's probably a big misconception also.
Yes.
There are many in this topic, but yes. Okay. Just want to clarify that.
No,
okay,
very important to note. That. So you have a Catholic married to Catholic in the church, sacramental marriage. 2 Christians in any ceremony, whether they know it's a sacrament or not, we see as a sacrament. But more and more Christians aren't baptized. And a lot of them, they're unbaptized and they have a civil ceremony in a courthouse. So how sacred can you call it? I mean, it's definitely still a natural bond. And even when it's a natural bond, again, there's a real flippancy. I don't have it locally, but I've worked with some priests who just say, if I can shuffle enough papers, I can make anything go away.
What is the situation with annulments when you have 2 people that aren't baptized at the courthouse? Does that still something that needs to be annulled?
That's still going to be a formal case.
Okay.
It is still a natural bond. It's going to pretty much go through the same thing. The only difference is there is a case. So John and Jane are both unbaptized. John and Jane are now divorced. John and Jane are not going to reconcile. John wants to marry Mary, who's Catholic. We've investigated the first bond, and for various reasons, it's hard to prove nullity, but it's broken. It's not going to be rehealed. If John decides to become a Catholic, there's a thing called a privilege of the faith case. I don't want to get into a bunch of detail, but there's basically a Pauline and Petrine. And basically, it is preferable that he be a Christian married to a Christian in a sacramental marriage as opposed to this dubious broken bond in the past. And that technically is not an annulment. It's actually a suppression of the marriage, and it has to go to Rome. It's a very...
Okay, so the devil's advocate question then is why, if you have someone who's baptized who was in some type of bad marriage and they want to become Catholic, and they'd been married at a courthouse to someone else who was baptized, why are people that weren't baptized allowed to have that exception, but people that are baptized?
There's also a very narrow grounds for a baptized Christian to also get a privilege of the faith case, but that's pretty narrow.
Okay.
It could happen, but it's very narrow.
Okay. Yeah, because I don't know I don't know much at all. Go ahead, Jen.
I just want to clarify something too, again, because since I wrote this book, I mean, I've been inundated with many questions, and so these things come up. So I'm getting a sense of what people do see clearly and what they don't.
Please do.
So I'd be I would not use the term bad marriage. In this context, the marriage is valid or not, but the fact that 2 people can't get along is a marriage. It's not bad because it's a sacrament. And so this is not to discount the underlying point you're making. I'm thinking more of the viewer. A sacramental marriage, once confected, it remains a marriage at least until death. And so the terminology comes to be very important here. Well, I'm in a bad marriage. I want to try to seek an annulment. This happens all the time. And people leave because they were in, quote, a bad marriage. So I'm just trying to, as I say, this is for the viewer. I understand that the genesis of your question. I'm just trying to make that clarification. So, okay, sorry, go ahead.
But no, I think the point, and I think that's words have weight. Again, over 3 decades of ministry, I know couples who have really borne a cross in their marriage. They had problems, issues.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes they're speaking to them in sacrament penance. So we have the seal over that. Sometimes it's outside of confession. But I know some people who suffered through difficult marriages. But we're married, and they basically use what I call benchmarks. Okay, at least until we get the kids on their own feet. Okay? Or at least, and in some cases, all right, we're going to stay together. We have a lot of friction, but we're at least going to be civil, you know. But in a world that's disposable, we throw everything away, including our shoes, where before you used to go to a cobbler and have new heels put on. And this goes back decades. Everyone just disposes of things when they want to.
Mm-hmm. How do you think the sexual revolution has affected the validity of marriages?
Doctor, why don't you go first?
Doctor? Thanks, Father. My formal education was Christendom College. I'm not even going to reveal my GPA. But, well, to your question, Colleen. So I have an entire chapter on, as you know, the sexual revolution. At the risk of giving away the ending, they lost. So you have a few things going on. I highlighted only a few. I could have highlighted 10. The prevalence of pornography has been awful. The rejection of fatherhood has been awful. There are, and I talk a little bit about how this actually plays out in ways that we didn't see at first. So the church has a living wage doctrine. Well, people don't like to talk about that. I mean, it's interesting. Of all the columns I've ever written for in the Register, and I probably written about 150, the one that I get the most pushback from Catholics, the topic that I get the most pushback for, is I mentioned the living wage doctrine. And as though I came up with it. Well, actually, I didn't. I don't know if Rome reads my columns. So the sex revolution is an anti-family. It's not just sexual; it's anti-family, and I think that has influenced not just marriage, but the desire to be married. So in my book, I outlined some numbers, and we went from about 2.5 generations ago. We had over 426,000 weddings in America per year. I like that number, 426,000. In the year 2020, we had fewer than 100,000 weddings. What's interesting is there are more Catholics now, I mean, at least on paper, there are more Catholics now than there were then. So if you start looking at those numbers, we've cut it in half and then cut it off again. And yet, the focus is on the crisis of the vocations to the priesthood. During the same time, in the last 25 years or so, the vocations to the priesthood are up. The vocations to the diaconate are way up. In that same time frame, the number of people getting married has dropped again in half.
Can I ask a question about the data? You said that in 2020 there were fewer weddings, but that was obviously the year of the pandemic when a lot of people weren't able to have physical weddings. So how did that affect the data? Was it already going downward, or was it a specifically low dip because of the pandemic?
I am both. Well, let's put it this way. I'm very happy you asked that question. During 2020, there was the churches were shut down, obviously. Okay. In many cases, sad to say, by ecclesiastical fiat. In other words, the state didn't say you have to close. I live in Florida. Okay. The state of Florida, DeSantis is actually great on this issue, which is why one of the reasons I moved to Florida. The sunshine is nice too. But 2020 was actually illustrative of something that I think had been under the surface. And so let me answer your numbers question, and I'll come back to that point. Numerically, you're asking a really good question. Well, yeah, but who is getting the Eucharist, or who is receiving the Eucharist? Who is getting confession? There were 97,200 weddings in the year 2020, if I remember correctly. I think I'm pretty close to that number. That followed a well-worn trajectory. So the numbers might have been slightly lower, but they weren't much. In other words, if you simply, I mean, I worked on, I think I mentioned last time, I worked on Wall Street for 18 years. So I was the guy with, all these screens on my desk and looking at these flashing numbers. So I got to be pretty good with charts. Well, the trajectory followed. Now to the point about the churches being closed. My contention in this book is that, and I think Father is touched on this very well, both here and in his previous interview, that in many cases, matrimony is not treated as a sacrament like the other 6 are treated like sacraments. But the problem is that once you stop treating matrimony as a sacrament, you start to sort of look at the other 6 a little differently. And so shutting down churches in 2020 was this is going to sound like a bit of a contradiction, but I think the phrasing kind of works. It was predictable in some ways. It was unforeseeable and yet predictable. I know that doesn't make sense. I'm sorry. You can edit that out.
Oh no, it makes total sense. Total sense.
But the point I'm getting at is that once you start treating the sacraments as less than sacraments, why not close churches? After all, why is it important to receive the Eucharist? Why is it important to receive penance? Why is it important to receive any of the sacraments? And so once you have, once you've sort of swept the majesty and the sacramentality of matrimony out of the table, go ahead and shut the churches. Even if, by the way, it's your idea and there's really no mandate to do it. And I think 2020 taught us a lot about where we were.
No, another thing, the point he raises about vocations, this is not original to me, and I was digging around and I cannot find the source. So whoever was the one who came up with this, when you start looking in the late 60s, but particularly during the 70s, where literally hundreds of thousands of women walked away from their religious vows, and large number of priests walked away from their priesthood, and you're sitting in the pew. Well, if Father can walk away from his marriage to marriage to church, but he's walking away from his sacrament. And while it's not a sacrament, Sister was doing that for 25 years and then she just gave up on it. I think that influences how you look at commitment to any vocation. And so, and I've mentioned this before, I don't know if when we were talking, in my first 4 years as a priest, I prepared over 200 couples for marriage and did 180 weddings. There's a particular questionnaire called the prenuptial investigation. You ask the bride and groom. It's all who, what, when, where, why. When would you marry, baptized, confirm? Then questions of why you couldn't get married. I got to the point I could do it on a blank sheet of paper because I'd done the questions so many times. So I take my younger brother priest ordained less than 8 years in my diocese. And we're blessed with a large number of vocations. And not just numbers, we have really good priests. When I was in, I fogged a mirror, didn't have a recent criminal record, got ordained. Now you have to pass all the tests and you have to be nice. It's all new rules. So, but we got it, 30 years ago we got in. But the point being is, of my brother priest, let's say less 5 years. 5 years, you better number. All the priests together, with the exception of 2 parishes, so take those 2 parishes out because they're kind of unique. These 24, 26 priests together haven't done 100 weddings.
Wow.
I mean, parishes that used to have these huge active pre-Cana programs, well, no, because there's only 3 couples. And the data just keeps going down and down and down. I'm afraid it's going to get worse before it gets better. Again, as he mentioned very clearly in the talk, no one wants to talk about pornography. It's killing men. And you don't know how to relate to a woman. You don't understand human sexuality. I personally believe for 3 generations, parents have failed their children without talking about human sexuality. Even practicing Catholics who take their kids to Mass and put their kids in Catholic school, they're like, oh, well, don't do bad things and 6th, 9th commandment, go to confession. And you need to sit and talk and have a serious talk to your kid about these things, because it doesn't matter. There's going to be some kid on a soccer team with his cell phone showing him stuff. There's going to be other influences, and we got to protect our kids and prepare them, but we're not doing that. We're not doing it.
I know that someone commented on one of these podcasts saying that people walked away from their vocations and that they thought that was a reason the marriages or annulments numbers skyrocketed. So I don't know if that was the source you were thinking of, but I do know someone brought that up.
Well, I think that person was also referring to, this is something I read years ago.
Okay. Yeah.
I thought it was just very insightful.
Yeah. It was a really interesting comment that hadn't occurred to me until I saw that she commented it. So yeah. So I think the two things that I definitely like to touch on before, like, in the, I guess, like the rest of the episode, is first of all, what is the appeals process for annulments? Because John, you had brought that up in our episode, but Father, you and I didn't touch on that. So, because you were saying that 90% of American annulments get overturned at the Roman Rota. And so I guess I don't know anything about the appeals process. So I'm just curious what that stat means, because at first I heard that and I was thinking, oh, that means that 90% of marriages or annulments that are being granted aren't valid. And then I was thinking about it and I'm like, well, maybe they're only getting appealed if people see a problem, in which case that means that the Roman Rota is doing its job. So I don't know anything about that. So I'm curious what both your thoughts are. And then I'd also like to discuss what ideas both of you have for how the church can uphold the sanctity of marriage and like encourage couples and have like good marriage prep. So
John, why don't you go first on the appeal process and I'll throw my 2 bits in.
Okay, fair enough. So I believe the number you're quoting, Colleen, was Father Murray, Gerald Murray, who's relatively famous. I guess he's on EWTN once a week these days. Excellent priest. He was working on a marriage tribunal in New York. I believe it was in the 1980s. And he made the comment in his book that I reviewed his book for the National Catholic Register maybe 3 years ago or so. And he made the comment that when he was working on working on the tribunal, 90% of the cases that were appealed were overturned at the Rota. That is not to say that 90% of cases that are appealed in the aggregate are overturned at the Rota. That wouldn't be my contention. The main reason I mention this in the book is one, it's difficult to get numbers. They're not reported as much as they should be. One of the difficulties I have with the process is the lack of clarity and the lack of visibility. But that was the number he gave. And so the reason I go to that is because people will often say, well, this stands alongside, they look at it this way, this stands alongside the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, this decision that my marriage was null. My marriage never was, okay? So I was simply pointing out the fact that can't be the case, because if that were true, it wouldn't be appealable, right? No one is appealing Munificentissimus Deus, right? So no one is appealing a doctrinal statement. What the numbers turn out to be, there's a lot of guesswork involved. But in terms of the specific, maybe Father can get dive a little bit deeper into the specifics you're talking about.
So, while it shifts around, every tribunal has a tribunal above it here in the United States. And ours used to be Baltimore, now it's Richmond. If I have a case that's gone through Arlington and you want to appeal it, it's first going to go to Richmond. Mm-hmm. They're going to review the whole case. Now, I'm speaking just for my tribunal. Mm-hmm. We've never had a case turned over.
Okay.
All right. We have some great priests, and this I'll back up. First off, I believe most of my brother priests, I think we got pretty good preparation. And for the handful of guys who were a little weak in their seminary formation or their praxis, they've talked to some of us older guys, so if we're going to present a case, we're doing the first stage. Secondly, the tribunal will not accept a case if they don't think there's any grounds. Mm-hmm. They're not going to go on a fishing expedition. So that kind of weeds out. Now, that doesn't happen a lot, but it happens enough. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't guarantee an outcome, but that kind of does weed it out. the tribunal tries to go forward always on more than one ground.
Mm-hmm.
So if I have 3 grounds and I get a decree of nullity on just one of the 3, at least we try to be thorough. Now, the norms have changed in the last 15 years. It used to be every single case was automatically appealed.
Okay.
And it was sent up first to Baltimore, now to Richmond, to make sure we don't put out a formal decree of nullity. And then someone 9 months later goes, oh, maybe that didn't work. So we now have a different check and balance system. I don't think it's as strong, but they didn't ask my opinion. But I have had cases appealed to Richmond, and they've come right back and they said there's nothing wrong with this case. I have one gentleman, he was fairly belligerent, and so I'm going to Rome. Well, I hope you have the money, because at that point, you're paying for everything. You don't pay you didn't pay for my diocese, didn't pay for Richmond, but you're going to have to hire someone in Rome. Put aside the last 3 years of the Rota, which has been a real mess. Any case, when the shutdown came, and we're now, we're 3.5 years past it, everything came to a screeching halt.
Okay.
So there is a backlog.
Okay.
So I'm going to go pre-2020. 2020. It really depends where your case was coming from.
Now, are they getting appealed because one of the parties is looking at it saying, I don't think this was a valid annulment, and so they're the ones appealing it now? So it used to be that they all got appealed, and now if one of the parties isn't happy with the decision, they'll appeal that decision?
Both existed.
Okay.
People, and most cases what happens is, I'll use my experience, I've had women committed to their marriage, and the husband just kind of, hey, I'm out of here.
Okay.
And not our tribunal. The guy went somewhere else and got a decree of nullity. He's like, no, she goes, we were married. And it's sad to say the grounds tend to be the weakest, the lack of due discretion, 27 years ago, after you've had 6 kids and lived in 3 states. And sometimes it's the husband, but either way, usually you have the stronger Catholic going, no, we're still married, and I don't want the church to say I wasn't married. But again, depending on the tribunal you go to, and this especially was bad right before the 83 code, between 79 and 83, they knew the new code was coming, and cases were actually being flown from Europe into New York and Chicago to be adjudicated because we could crank them out like no one's business. One of the problems in Europe is a lot of dioceses do not have tribunals, or they have very weak tribunals, and that's because of socialism. You see, the government decides how much priests are paid in Germany.
Oh, wow.
So if I'm a parish priest in Germany, I make $125,000 a year. As a bishop, I make $250,000. But if you're on the tribunal, you only make $75,000 a year. So no priest wants that job.
Gotcha.
And in South America, it's even worse, which is entirely story. We could do 2 hours on the tribunals of South America and their problems.
So in my, I'm sorry, Father,
go ahead. Go ahead, John.
Okay. So in my book, I mentioned on Father's point that, I mentioned I was on Wall Street for quite a long time. And when the dollar is weak, shoppers come to America to buy stuff. When the church is weak, people come to America for annulments. It's called annulment shopping. It's a fairly well-known thing. And so, but again, back to I think the genesis of your question. Annulments are given out. In some cases, they shouldn't be given out. And my contention is that it's quite a few, and it's happened for decades. That's my contention. What the number is, I don't know what the number is. Only we'll know in heaven, God willing. We'll know in heaven how many it is. I'm simply saying that there are people, and Father mentioned a group that has become very near and dear to my heart since last year. And they call themselves standers. Those are people who have been abandoned by their spouse and believe in the validity and sanctity of their marriage. They believe the marriage is intact. I've talked to people who have been married 30 years and had this, over 40 years and have this. That a tribunal said, no, there was no marriage, because after all, back in 19 whatever, well, the lack of due psychological, the example used, because I think this is an important point to make, is I think, especially because you're with Human Life International lists, the last I checked, the Canon Law Society of America as a dissenting group. So the Canon Law Society of America is essentially formed a monopoly and been good enough to explain to us what they mean by psychological issues and due discretion. The example they give and the canon law explained is this, and I mentioned in my book. Let's say you have a scenario where a couple is married. They haven't dated much, which to my mind is absolutely irrelevant. But they haven't dated much, and her notion of marriage was shaped in large measure by Romeo and Juliet, by Shakespeare play. And they said, yeah, this would be grounds. Really? And as I point out, what if my view of marriage, and again, my marriage, what if my view of marriage were shaped largely by the Beach Boys, Journey, Magna Pi episodes, the Rockford Files, et cetera, et cetera? What if? What if it did? What if it were? Then what? Oh, this guy can recite the Rockford Files, all 6 seasons. That has no bearing. And yet, I could see Father's Rockford Files fan, so that's cool. We keep getting along, Father. This is excellent. So, but the point is that the example they're using, you would think they would use a pretty extreme example to make the point, right? They give that example. Well, she read a lot of Shakespeare. Well, okay, I guess I can disclose this. My wife graduated from Christendom College with a degree in English literature. She read a lot of Shakespeare. Is our marriage therefore invalid? This is the insanity that has taken place. And since we're overall trying to talk about why we're here, and I don't want to, sort of front run your next question, but in many dioceses, the church is not standing up for the validity of the sacrament. It's just that's the bottom line. In some dioceses, 100% of applications go through and then 100 of those are approved for annulments. Last time I checked, I think it was 14 dioceses. It's a problem. And so going forward, and again, it's always easy to look in the rearview mirror and say, what could have happened differently? Well, as I always tell my kids, I have 9 children, and sort of our family motto is, life's about what you do next. What we do next has to involve, from the pulpit, we need to hear that matrimony is a sacrament. I'm 53. I think I've missed Sunday Mass because of illness or weather maybe 5 times in my life. I try to go to daily Mass. We're in Florida. We have hurricanes, so I can't always make it. And I'm trying to remember the times I've heard about the sacramentality of matrimony. And I should point out, Father, I'm not in front row, so I don't go to your sermons. So this is not meant as an indictment. But I'm saying that overall, the fact of the matter is it's just not discussed. And as I mentioned in the last interview, in the previous interview we did, I don't know, as a speechwriter, I always ask my clients, who's the audience? If somebody comes to me, they want a speech written, I say, who's the audience? Even before I ask them the topic. And I feel like saying to the priest, look, Father, with respect, who is in your audience? It's married people, their children, people looking to get married. Why are we discussing matrimony more? In my opinion, pre-Cana begins in 2 places. It begins in church, 2 young people. It begins at home. My first pre-Cana teachers were Mary Kay Clark and Bruce Clark. Now, if you look them up, like what church was that at? It was in our house, the domestic church. I saw 2 people who loved each other. Flawed people who were edified and nourished by the sacrament of matrimony. So, in any case, I don't want to get too far afield, but I think these are just important things for the viewers to comprehend. So, I hope I didn't get too far afield there, but I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I want to touch on about 3 different things, John, and kind of go to a little commercial here.
Okay.
A group called Mary's Advocates reached out to me after my video. I knew of them very vaguely. I'm going to leave these books with you in case anyone wants to email. One, and these are 2 internal publications of the organization. a gift of self, a spiritual companion for separating divorce, faithful to the sacrament of marriage. And very nice little book. And it touches on basically wounded people left behind. Mm-hmm. What am I supposed to do? The second one, very interesting, didn't read all of it. So they sent me a couple copies, so I'm going to leave you this one. When is a marriage null? And it's a guide to the grounds, fairly thorough. And it's written by an Italian priest who appears to have a great deal of experience. But when he goes into it, yes, he goes into technicalities and what have not, but he is working constantly from the perspective that we have to assume there's always the sacrament. And I've used this a lot, mostly when talking to high school students, because this comes up because they know people who've gotten annulments or their own parents maybe. I said, if I'm saying that marriage didn't take place, it is as if I go up with the key, genuflect, open the tabernacle, take out the sabor and go, this isn't the Eucharist. Mm-hmm. I'm going to put this away now. Because we're saying a sacrament didn't take place. They also sent me an extra copy again of Mrs. Howell's book, which I think, again, I would not encourage most lay people to read this because you kind of blow them away. It's a little heavy. But it's a great resource if there's anyone out there who was working in an academic field, because she has done some really hard work. Couple things. So I believe pre-Cana begins in 4th grade.
Okay.
And the reason I believe 4th grade is that's when you start really having friends. You have acquaintances up to that point. But by 4th grade, you and Joey really, we go, and we're in a scouting organization or in a sports group or whatever. The first thing is understanding friendship. Mm-hmm. Now, then 2 years later, you're saying, well, 6th grade, still fairly young. What does it mean to have a friend of the opposite sex? Okay. That's where we start laying foundations. Human relationship and Christian relationship. Now, with nothing against the people of Florida, but, and I'm blessed with my brother priests up here, I preach on marriage fairly frequently. Now, I was also in a unique situation. Active reserve, I spent 27 years in a uniform, 3 in seminary, 24 years as a priest, as a military chaplain. Mm-hmm. And I got to see the effects of the wonderful program of CCD from 1980 till present day. Mm-hmm. And I'll give a wonderful little example. I hate to scandalize you, John. I'm in my 2nd tour in Iraq in Fallujah. I'm following a great priest who literally brought over every piece of equipment a priest would ever need. So I was in a deployed environment with a monstrance, thurible, humeral veil so we could do a holy hour. And our makeshift chapel there and base Fallujah was very safe. Outside the wire, not so much so. During Lent, after our daily mass was at 1800, 6 p.m., we did the Stations of the Cross on Fridays. We decided that for Paschaltide, we were going to do a holy half hour. We're going to expose the Blessed Sacrament. We're going to go do 2 decades of the Rosary. We're going to have silent prayer, benediction. I had these 2 corporals who were friends. They came to daily mass probably 3 times a week. Always there on Sunday. They were my altar boys. Really good Marines. The 3rd Friday, we finished up the half holy hour. My altar boy that day was a battalion commander, a colonel. So he's gone outside to dump out the charcoal. They're helping me put away the monstrance, the veil, and everything. The colonel's coming in, and they both ask me, and this is not a joke, Padre, this benediction is really beautiful. When did you come up with this? They should do this back in America. And with a perfectly straight face, I said, well, one day after I composed the Pange Lingua, before I wrote the Tantum Ergo, I really thought we should. And the colonel's like, Father, don't lead them on. These kids had gone through CCD, had been confirmed, went to Mass every Sunday, were from California, had never seen exposition.
Wow.
So if this is the guys, how many 19-year-old boys are going to Mass regularly on Sunday, let alone daily Mass? They understood the Eucharist, but a very limited life of faith, what else don't they know about? And again, in the military, a third of the people I dealt with were completely unchurched or uncatechized, call them what you want. And so they'll run off and get married for the justice of the peace and, just on a whim. But I think that the key issue, getting away from the technicalities of appeals and the process, I want to talk about, again, this attitude of process where we shove enough paperwork in and something comes out the back end. And again, I also agree, it's hard to find out some numbers. Mm-hmm. There's a reason I'm not a member of the Canon Law Society of America, because I want to go to heaven. And it's one of it's a goal. You got to have goals.
I like it. I have that same goal, Father, although they're not inviting me, as you might imagine.
Yeah, well, when I finished my doctorate in tribunal studies, I got a letter. Send us money. You can join us. Thanks.
Nice.
Shred. I'll stay an advocate procurator. I'm happy while I'm doing my parish work. Don't need to be a judge. But I read their stuff. And again, they, like in many dioceses, I'll go back up, like say 25 years ago. I was on a priest workshop talking to priests of other dioceses, and somehow it came up that I was working on these tribunal cases. These priests like, you do that sort of stuff? I said, well, pretty much every priest of the diocese is expected to get their hand. Oh, our diocese, a policy, if someone comes in that says they need annulment work, we just give them the phone number and we send them away. And that is common for, I believe, over half the dioceses of America. So Father Jones in his parish, good priest that he is, he's not involved at all. So I sent Jane away, and then 18 months later, she comes back with a letter saying, they said my marriage was null. He was never involved in the process, and the people they dealt with, in many cases, it was just a big paper chase. Mm-hmm. And I do believe it whittles down along the periphery people's attitude of what marriage is all about. You could have the best pre-Cana program in the world. Where is the person entering what is their attitude? You don't have to know everything. Getting married is not that hard, okay? People have been doing it for thousands of years. We want them to understand that they're entering into a permanent, faithful, exclusive bond that is there. You're there to get each other to heaven, all right? Today I was quoting from St. Augustine, the second reading of the Office of Readings. Everyone loves. The question is, what do you choose to love? Well, sometimes as a spouse, you have to choose to love your spouse even though you don't like them that day because you're having a bad day. Well, get past not liking sometimes. That's the problem in our society. We've got things out of sync. And my biggest concern, put aside the numbers, whatever it is, I'm going to have to stand in front of God and say, I did not believe there truly was a sacramental marriage here. And I worked and spent time and advocated for the church to say, this person is actually free now to marry this other person. I am not going to do that lightly. Now I mentioned all these people I met with in the last couple of weeks. I'm dealing with people, who made a series of bad decisions. I haven't delved that deeply into all these cases. But again, if Catholics don't understand marriage, why would Bob, who's never been to church, is unbaptized, is a product of modern American culture, what does he have?
Yeah, it's definitely a sad situation looking at our world, but luckily people are doing things to hopefully, have better marriage prep and try to fix some of the problems like both of you are doing. So thank you. Do either of you have any last thoughts for today?
Sean, why don't you go?
Well, Father, I was really happy that I think you have it there on the table, Catherine Godfrey Howell's book. I want to hold that up because, as it turns out, she's a personal friend of mine.
Oh!
And in fact, she wrote the foreword to this book. So I'm pretty familiar with her writing, as it turns out. And so I do break down a lot of these issues in here, as we talked about. But as I've mentioned, Katie's foreword is the best part of my book. Um, it doesn't require any humility to say that either. It's just over the top correct. And she was nice enough to write, Clark has written a book here about marriage and the Eucharist. Only a man who passionately loves his own wife could write this book. And I think it is actually a love letter to the Eucharist. One of the things that I mention in here, and by the way, thanks again, Katie. One of the things that I mentioned in this book, and I was so happy that Katie wrote, what she did, is because I thought, okay, she gets it. She gets what I'm trying to illustrate here. The seven sacraments are symbiotic by design. So to clarify that, because I always try to do this, I think this is super important. When my wife Lisa and I go to daily mass, receive communion, and kneel down together in thanksgiving, our marriage is stronger for it. When Lisa and I go to confession together and kneel down and say our penance, our marriage is stronger for it. The penance is better because of the matrimony being strong. The seven sacraments are symbiotic. I think we need to be talking about that more. At present, we have a shocking, shameful, scandalous, etc., number of Catholics who do not believe in the real presence. My contention is very simple. Many of those same people do not believe in the sacramentality of matrimony. These things work together. So to write a love letter to matrimony is to write a love letter to the Eucharist. We have to be talking about this. If we're going to want people to come back and believe in the real presence, here's a good start. Preach about, and this isn't just for priests, it's for laity. Again, I'm Byzantine Catholic, and so we're incensed at liturgy. And why? Because we are supposed to be icons to the world. So part of being that icon to the world is explaining and helping people understand the beauty of the sacraments. So I think if your viewers, I hope that your viewers can take away from this that God loves you. He loves marriage. He loves your marriage. He wants to draw closer to you. He's giving you the grace to draw closer to him. We have to live sacramental lives. Everything starts there. We have to raise our children in the faith, to Father's point. Look, I homeschool my children. It's been an incredibly good decision to do that. My wife and I, and we've learned a lot about our faith in the process. And so this is why I don't like to use the term homeschooling. I like family schooling. When we started doing this, homeschooling, my wife went to a private Catholic school in California. So you can make of that what you will. So she came to Christendom and fell in love with the faith, largely because she was hearing it for the first time. And so when she started homeschooling, she would learn things every day. I'd come home and she'd say, John, guess what I learned today? At first I said, well, you mean what the kids learned, right? She said, no, what I learned. Family schooling, learning the faith, nourishing it, read. Right now we have a crisis of heroes. Father Rutler years ago said that we have a crisis of saints. We have a crisis of heroes. If you look around, who are the heroes in the world? We don't have to rely on what the modern world says are today's heroes. We have the saints. We need to read the lives of the saints. We need to explain those to our children. Growing up, we said litanies to the saints every morning before we started homeschooling. We need to turn to the saints. Everything I'm mentioning here is very basic. There's no insight at all, because these are things that people used to take for granted. Well, of course you read the lives of the saints. Of course you go to confession. Of course these are things we have to return to. We have to return to the basics. And if we can do that, and those of us who are called to be icons to the world, if we can be icons to the world about marriage, that is how we begin to turn these things around.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, couldn't more agree with that. belief in the Eucharist. Now, I break into two groups. I put aside whatever numbers they put in the polls. When they say X number of Catholics, well, first off, who's being asked where? Are they in the parking lot of the grocery store? Hey, are you Catholic? What do you believe? As opposed to someone coming out of my Sunday Mass. So, but I have to be also honest. The way the Mass is supposedly, I hate to use the term, kind of offered by some of my brother priests, there's no sacrifice. There's no solemnity. There's no reverence. I'm blessed to be in a unique, somewhat bizarre parish. And because going back decades, we've had just a sequence of great pastors, great parochial vicars. And I'll touch on a couple things. The parish has had what I call extended adoration. It's not perpetual because we don't do it from Saturday morning to Monday morning, because over the weekend, the chapel that we do adoration in is an overflow chapel. We have a screen in there because we can't fit people into my church. So we have that problem. But no pastor can mandate Eucharistic adoration. There has to be a sensus fidelium. The people of God have to want it. Mm-hmm. And so we have some young adults who help coordinate and schedule. And it's been a real magnet. Yeah. Many of our new parishioners, that's one of the reasons they came, or they came like, wow. Mm-hmm. And as a priest, when you can give out a penance and say, hey, can you go over and spend 15 minutes in front of the Blessed Sacrament? Or especially tell a teenager. Mm-hmm. And we have this little guide, how to pray silently. Because we haven't taught kids, we've taught them pray errors. We didn't teach them to pray. Yeah. We taught about something about Jesus, but didn't know about Christ the King. And so you get that across. We have 3, sometimes 4 daily masses a day. We have confession twice a day, 6 days a week. Why? I have a great pastor, Father Daniel Gee, Father Tom Shapanik, myself. And I've had people say, well, Father, why can't you meet with me this time? I said, well, I don't know if I'll be done with confessions. Can you come at this time? And I've had brother priests in other dioceses like, what, do you have a parish full of sinners? I said, let me give you a quick, I think it's important to touch on this because we're talking about sacramentality. Let's say you only have 1,000 people come to Mass every weekend at your parish. We have many more than that. 1,000 people going to communion. Some children. So you have 1,000 people between 7 and 70. And I'm going to give those 1,000 people each 3 minutes. Just 3 minutes. From bless me, Father, to I doing the last words of absolution. That's 3,000 minutes. Let's divide by 60. That's 50 hours for everyone to go to confession once, and they only got 3 minutes, and you have no questions, no concerns, no particular issues. Everyone's boom, boom, boom. I mean, we're running through this. Okay. That's just not realistic. But even if you did that, 50 hours for those 1,000 people. So look at your parish numbers. The parish I grew up in, they have the same number of priests I do. They have confessions for 30 minutes once a week. That tells you how that people see from the pew what Father thinks is important. If Father only schedules 30 minutes confessions a week, that says it's that important. If there's 3 priests but only 1 daily Mass, that says what's important. If the attitude is we need 26 extraordinary ministers of communion to get communion done so we can get Mass done and over with. Well, why? I'm not saying you drag it out, but it's the holy sacrifice of the Mass. So that's why my pastor schedules the Mass not every 90 minutes, but every 2 hours. So heaven forbid Mass go 1 hour and 3 minutes. Be still my soul. John used the term symbiotic. I like the term interwoven. If ever done weaving and stuff. Mm-hmm. Once you pull one thread, all the other threads are going to go. And I tell this to couples in pre-Cana all the time. Okay, you go on to confession, sacramental moment. gone to communion, sacrament. Every time you fulfill your marriage vows, you show affection, you show attention, but particularly when you're far apart, and this goes back to my military experience, I coined a phrase, synchronized prayer. So when I was on my second, third tour, I had a lot of Marines from California, and we're there in Iraq. So when they got up first thing in the morning, I had them say their night prayers, because that's when their kids were saying their prayers.
Oh.
And the kids knew that Dad knew that the kids knew that Dad knew that kids knew that Dad knew. That Jesus knew that we're all praying at the same time. They're in sync. I said, prayer and love do not dissipate over space and time. They actually grow stronger. So when you're faithful to your spouse on a business trip, you have grace. Now, in the Navy and Marine Corps, you can't wear a wedding ring. Not when you're deployed, not aboard ship. It's unsafe. Because aboard ship, you'll catch this goes back centuries. The ring will catch on something as you're climbing around, you lose your finger.
Yeah.
So the tradition goes back to the 18th century. You have a fine gold chain and you wear your ring under your uniform. So when I was an ensign, I was working with this great priest and we're getting ready for Sunday Mass, a couple hundred sailors aboard an aircraft carrier. And he made all the sailors take out their rings and put it outside the uniform. Now, technically, that's against uniform regulation. But during Mass, Father said, I'm in charge. So they can go. He said a few things. We won't go with that. But he wanted them to be like, that's your spouse. Now, by the time I got with my Marines on my second tour, most of my Marines got rid of their wedding rings completely. And they would have one tattooed with their wife's name. And that's never going away. I think that's sometimes a better ring. And we could go, I would love you if you'd have a married couple that's like a mentor couple who does pre-Cana work. Mm-hmm. The whole theology behind rings, their connection. There's a beautiful, beautiful history behind that.
I'll have to look into that.
Yeah.
Well, that's beautiful.
Yeah.
Thank you both for joining today. This has been a really excellent discussion, and it's been great to kind of revisit the subject and hear both your points of view and be able to discuss it together. So thank you, John, and thank you, Father.
Thank you.
And to all of our listeners, please like, follow, and subscribe. I'll put links to all the books we mentioned today in the description. Leave us a 5-star review and check out the new ebooks we have coming out, and keep on living the culture of life. God bless.